we're going to be talking about SOLIDWORKS Composer core concepts and just prepping your model for asset generation. Okay, so my name is Ricky Wen. I'm one of the senior application engineers at Hawkridge Systems. I've been working with Composer for the past 3-4 years now, just kind of more on the technical publication space, and then seeing where our customers are mostly using it, and then seeing where we can kind of best fit and best help. First thing is, did you catch the first video in our series? So this one we're talking about prepping the model for asset generation. Basically what that means is we brought in the model from SOLIDWORKS already, right? We brought it from SOLIDWORKS into Composer, and we've imported it in. And today what we're going to talk about is some of the options that you want to take a look at, modifying the paper space and things like that. But you got your models imported. Now what? That's what we're going to do next. But then the first part is just how to import that CAD model. So remember I mentioned we're going to try to rework the foundation, make sure everyone's kind of on the same page. The first part of the series is going to be one of the pro tips is by our product manager, Scott Woods. He is talking about how to import the CAD model. So you'll see this is the link that you want to go to. You can screenshot it. It's also on our YouTube channel as well. So it's going to talk about the correct way to import any CAD model, and then Scott's going to go through that process. It's about a 4 to 5 minute video and show you exactly how that's done. Okay. So today's agenda, what we're going to do is we're going to prepare the model for asset generation. We'll be taking a look at selection sets, environmental effects, part properties, locations, and then also just creating that first view. Okay. So also the introductory webinars, not specific to Composer, but just Composer, and then other products as well, are on our website. You can see here the www.hawkridgesys.com/videos. So if you go there, you can also view some of our past webinars and some of our other content as well. All right. So the very first thing is just selection sets. Talk about kind of why we would use selection sets, and then afterwards how to create them, and then once it's created, how do you add to an existing selection set? So one of the questions is, what file type did you export and import? Did you mean into Composer? Which file type did I import into Composer? I did an assembly. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question correctly, but just kind of as a future reference, basically what we did was we took it was a file that we'd modeled up. I had to check with Scott to see exactly where he had gotten his file set from, but it was an assembly file from SOLIDWORKS, and then we brought that into Composer, which would create an SMG file. Not sure if that answers your question, but let me know. Yep. Okay, excellent. So let's take a look at Composer. So selection sets, and really the reason why we want to use selection sets, you can see here, this is just the model that we'd be bringing in from SOLIDWORKS. On the left-hand side, you'll see that we have your assembly tree that's brought in, kind of that information is brought in from SOLIDWORKS. Our collaboration tab, which is going to talk about a lot about the environment, which we'll mention too. And then the views. So naturally, there's going to be not a view for you to work with, and then what we're going to do is create that first view where we have some of our properties and things like that. And just understanding selection sets. And also, by the way, these concepts where I'm going, selection sets first, you don't necessarily have to do it first in the beginning. I just structure it in a way where it makes sense. So the first thing is selection sets. If you guys haven't used selection sets before, really the reason you would use them, it's an easy way to select multiple components at one time and change their color or change their properties. So for example, you have your assembly here on the left-hand side, or the assembly tree. And normally it's grouped out by a subassembly, components, things like that. You'll see on the left-hand side as I'm clicking them. So these are sorted out based off of how SOLIDWORKS brought them in, or how it was created inside of SOLIDWORKS, right, with subassemblies and assemblies and parts. So if there's at any point where you find out that, well, you know what? For example, it would be useful if the spinner, the propeller, and then the motor itself was one selection. So for example, if I'm constantly moving and translating this set of components here, if it's not a subassembly over here that I can just select once, what you can do is create a selection set. Okay. So for example, say I want to do it for a bunch of the propellers. Like for example, this guy, this spinner, the propeller, and then the motor. And then I'm going to do it for the other ones as well. And then how you would create a selection set is really simple. You just select the components you need. You can also select them on the left-hand side too in the assembly tree, and then go here to create a selection set. You can also do a Control-Alt-S if you're more familiar with the keyboard key. So over here to create a selection set, and then where you'd find it is right on the bottom. You're going to give it a name. For example, I'll say I'm going to call them propellers. So if I minimize my assembly tree here, you're going to find your selection sets right under your views and your scenarios right here, right? Obviously, you give them a name so it's easier for you to identify exactly what they are. So if I click on them, notice how instead of me going to control selecting or shift selecting all the individual geometry or the actors again, these propellers selection set is like a grouping, and it organizes them in a way where I can, if I wanted to turn them off, I can just uncheck them, turn them back on. But you'll notice that I forgot one. So there's one in the back. So if you forget to add something to a selection set, right, what I can do is simply select it, the ones that I want to add, and as you probably guess, I need to tell it which selection set I want to add it to. I'm going to hold down Control and then also select the selection set. Then I'll right-click, and then I'll go to Add Actors to Selection Set. So I'm going to add the other three components that I missed into that selection set. When I do that, you'll notice that if I expand out my selection set, it now includes all 4 of them. So for example, if I were to hide them or even go down to the aspect of changing the color, for example, I can go ahead and do that too. Okay? So once again, selection sets, easy way to organize, especially if they're not sub-assemblies that were created. One thing would be that if you have like a lot of nuts and bolts in your sub-assembly and you just want an easy way to just hide all of them by organizing them all into one, because they're probably not all in an assembly, sub-assembly set up that way, then you can put them into a selection set and then hide them all at the same time, change the color accordingly as needed. Okay? So after we talk about selection sets, what I want to do is let's discover what other things that we can do in regards to our environmental effects. So we'll talk about adjusting the paper space, where we would do that, and then also the environment, the ground, and then also a little bit the lighting, kind of some of the options available there. And you'll see that there's quite a bit of options that we can modify inside a Composer. So it gives you as a user a lot of flexibility. So the first thing is just prepping this one to make sure that it's all set to go for when I publish this out. And where I would change the page size is under my File, Properties, and I go to my Document Properties, and we're going to go to Paper Space. So in our paper space, under Format is where I can choose what the page size is going to be. Now you'll see here there's an 8.5 by 11, 8.5 by 14, A1, A4. So this is just different sizes. Also there's orientations like portrait and landscape as well. So you imagine if you're printing straight from Composer and you want it to be on a letter size, you can modify it that way to format to be that. Sometimes what we find is most people are not doing that. So they're not printing straight from it, so you're not locked down to be using 8.5 by 11. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're just going to set it to be the viewport ratio. Set that format to basically have it enclosed to what you see here. And then from that, I'm just going to left-click in the background just because I don't want anything selected. And on the left-hand side over here, under what we call our properties, I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to take a look at the publication aspect. So you'll see here our format right now is set to be free. And we have user define where you can enter in what that ratio, that aspect is going to be of the width and the height, as well as 16 by 9 and 4 by 3. And here, what we're going to do is go with 16 by 9, just for typically kind of thinking ahead, even though we're not going to be doing it in today's lesson, is we're going to be, imagine that we're going to do animations, right? Just by having it be set to 16 by 9, it just sets it up easier for that ratio to be used if we're going to do animations. Then you don't have to change it later on and modify and move things around. So we can set that publication aspect now here. Right. In addition, you'll notice that lots of different options in terms of our environment. You'll notice if I go to my collaboration tab, under my environment, you'll see there's a ground. I can turn on my ground. I can turn off. And the compass I'm using for navigation in the upper right-hand corner. This doesn't output to your image, so you don't have to worry about that. It's just helpful for navigation. But you'll see ground here. You can turn that on and off. And similar to SolidWorks, there's if you are a SolidWorks user, if you're not, it's independent of it. So if I needed to turn off my ground, for example, instead of unchecking here and locating it, I can just click on Control G. So G for ground. Control G will turn it on and off. So you can see here, if I look kind of at the bottom, you'll see actually a Dassault kind of logo on the bottom. Click on Control G, it'll hide it. Control G will bring it back. It's the same thing as turning it off here as well. Okay. So at the same time, if I click on ground, really anything inside of Composer, most things, it has its own specific properties. For example, if I click on the ground, you know, to have little Dassault systems on the back, on the bottom of the ground. If I decided that ground texture is not what I want, I can clear that out. I can select it, backspace, and then click enter, and notice how it disappears, right? And then you can choose, say you're going to put this more of an environment like on a ground surface or gravel or something like that. You can insert that image into your ground. Okay, so you have your ground. Also notice that I don't want a grid here down on the bottom, right? It doesn't kind of serve a purpose for me. So I can turn off my ground grid, as well as any of the other options that are going to be useful to you. Maybe you want a ground shadow for this. And then also, you notice as I did a zoom to fit, right now we're set it to be, we have perspective turned on. And where you control that option is over here for camera perspective. If I turn it off and do a zoom to fit, you'll notice that this has no perspective on it. But if I turn it on, I can turn on my camera perspective mode, right? And then you control that value, that angle with which how much perspective is set up inside your preferences. Other things that we want to take a look at is just overall lighting mode. So if I take a look at on my left-hand side here, you'll see lights. You can change it so that it's a soft light, where I just have one light. There's medium, metal, heavy metal, high contrast, shaded illustration. This is going to change the lighting for all of them. Now in this case, maybe we'll go with a metal, and you can see it's pretty easy to change if we ever need to go back and make adjustments to it. There's also the ability to add on static lighting. What static lighting basically does is when I have this one enabled, when I have it checked on, the lighting will be set. For example, if I rotate my model, notice that the lighting doesn't move, the kind of the reflections, everything stays the same. Whereas if I have it turned off, then it will move adjust accordingly, kind of based how I rotate it and how I pan this around. And then there's also per pixel lighting, right? What that's going to do is it's going to give us more of a realistic result. So it's basically lighting our actors per pixel as opposed to grouping it. So it's going to display kind of shaded surfaces based off the color and illumination at each pixel. So you can have that one on, or you can have it off. And then once we have it on additional, we can choose if we want to add in shadows, ambient inclusion, which will show more shadowing. There's the intensity, with which you can turn it on. Let me zoom in, and then you can kind of see exactly where that is. Let's turn it on right around and zoom in here a little bit. You can kind of see the intensity with which it's adding in. and also we have the radius. So the radius is showing you coverage, and the intensity is just going to be how dark it is. Okay, so all just prepping your model, so we're creating that first view, so it's just giving us more of a realistic rendering or more realistic representation of kind of what our Hawkeye is going to look like. And then last one we have on the bottom is this glow. If I want to turn it on, basically it'll put like a little halo around my my object. I can increase that, decrease that, right? How much that effect's going to be, but we'll go ahead and turn it off for now. All right, so that's going to be your environmental effects. So you can see there's lots of different properties. We haven't even selected any of our components yet and modified its properties. But once we do, we'll go ahead and pop back over to my PowerPoint, and let's kind of see what's next. So we talked about paper space. We talked about modifying the ground, turning that on and off, adjusting if you're removing the logo as needed, turning on the grid and turning off the grid, and modify some of its lighting. Then let's talk about just the part properties, right? We'll talk about how you would color, how you would add color, just modify some of the color, copying appearances. Say you did one side and you want to do the other side. Transparency, how we'll modify that using our opacity bar. Hiding components, and then some of the render styles. So here, right, what we're looking at is on the left-hand side, this is now where we can go kind of specific onto some of our, what we're talking about. You know, maybe we'll go back to my propellers, and we won't kind of do it for everything. Say we'll work on a few propellers. Maybe we'll work on this one over here in the kind of the front. And maybe I just wanted to pop a little bit more, say where these are spinning and, you know, it's flying up in the air and I don't know exactly where it is because it's blue. So it's kind of blending in with everything. So maybe I want this to pop. Maybe I can make this a yellow or a red. So by clicking on the color, I can go over here on the left-hand side, and you'll see the properties then begin to filter out based off what we selected. So this color, I can switch to like a yellow, something that just pops a little bit more, maybe like a red, right? So I can do it for one, and then I can do it for the rest of them. But then you find out, hey, you know what? If I did it for that one and I want to make sure maybe you chose a very specific color, what you can do is you can always copy the appearance. So I can select that color, and I can go over here to copy appearance properties for that color. And then I can then paste it onto the other ones. Okay? So you imagine that, say, for example, I want to copy, and then it copies it over here, right? In this case, I want to do the reverse. So I want to make sure that this is all set up to be, for example, red, right? So I want this blue. I'm going to go ahead and copy this red, right? And then you can do the same thing all the way across. This will also, you know, just in the case of where we did it, maybe if we wanted the motor and the spinner to all be red as well, then that's probably where we would do like a selection set, for example, right? So in this case, we'll go ahead and select these two, and then copy the appearance of this one, and then I'll make the other ones red as well. Okay, so modifying the appearance, modifying the properties, taking a look at opacity, and really the transparency. Imagine that if this shield here and then also the sides, maybe I'd want to see kind of some of the internal components, right? So it's just easier to see, gives it like more of a translucent effect. I can click on the individual components. I can choose the environmental effect. I can make this more chromic. I can go like more, this can be more metal on the front, more reflective. And then these side pieces can be like plastic, for example. So it should be a lighter weight. So you can choose this so it's more, so remember how we changed the entire lighting, but this is now more specific to the geometry we're selecting. And then I mentioned opacity. Well, you know, if you were to look at it, if you were kind of do an exploded view, you can see exactly how all this comes together, some of the internal components, but right now we can't. So what I can do is I can modify its opacity or the transparency. And to do that, I can select them. You don't have to kind of wait for your designer or your engineer to kind of do it inside of SOLIDWORKS and send it over. You can select the component, your actors, And then over here on the left-hand side, we're taking a look at opacity. So I can turn this down, right? I can go so far as just having it pretty much all hidden, which is an opacity of 0. Or I can go maybe halfway, about to a 128. That still preserves the components, but then if I look close enough, I can see the insides. Right? It's going to give us more of a translucent effect, a transparent, so you can see exactly inside what's going on. So on any of our components, we can control its opacity. As you can see, there's quite a few properties that we can modify and then make it so that we can kind of see exactly what's going on with everything, right? This also is another part where you can begin hiding components that maybe are not useful to you, kind of isolating them, going in that realm, right? One nice little thing is with going along with our selection sets, if later on you want to kind of create a view where you bring everything back, what I can do is I can isolate. For example, let's go ahead and take a look at my propellers. If at some point I wanted to just focus on them, I can go to my visibility and then say show selection and hide others, which essentially isolate just those 4. Okay, so that's the benefit of my selection set is instead of having to select all of them, I can just select on the selection set and then go to my visibility tab, right? And then just to bring everything back and just click on show all geometry and just bring it back to that orientation with what we're used to before. Okay. And then the other one is going to be our render styles. So if you kind of noticed in my PowerPoint, I'll show you real quick. I've actually split 3 images over here. They're kind of a little bit overlaid on top of each other, one showing wireframe, one more of a shaded illustration, and one more of a technical, just to show you that you can modify some of your render styles. It's different from lighting in the way where it affects everything else. So for example, I can go into my render tab here, and under mode, I can do smooth. I can change this to be smooth with the outline. I can be flat with technical. I can be flat technical. You kind of saw wireframe. There's one where there's points. I've never really seen this one used too much, but I can probably see where the benefit would be, right? Shaded illustration with silhouettes. So it gives you a lot of options, and you can kind of change and pick and choose what's going to give you the more realistic result of kind of what you're looking for. Say we'll go with a let's go with the flat. Let's go with the flat. We'll go with the technical. So it gives us the kind of still the shadowy feel, more of a realistic versus just kind of how bright the flat technical would be. Okay. So once that's done with our properties, we'll go ahead and pop back over my PowerPoint, and let's see what's next. So we talked about applying colors, copying the appearance over, modifying the transparency via the opacity property, then hiding the components, and then modifying the render style. Under locations and creating the first view. So we're going to talk about now, we're not going to basically move too much of the translation of the components or anything like that, but I did want to talk about neutral position, where kind of for SOLIDWORKS identifies where the neutral position, and then it brings it into kind of Composer. You'll know exactly where is what. And then afterwards, we'll create our views, and we'll take a look at some of what the buttons mean. So here, what we're doing is we want to make sure that these properties that we have, kind of the neutral properties and locations. So over here in our transform tab up top, we have transform, and we have the ability to do linear explosions. So for example, if I take everything here, let me zoom out a little bit, and then do a linear explode, I can explode along a certain direction. Right? This would be very, very good for doing exploded views. Probably not step by step, but then you can see all the components that were associated with it. We'll do a spherical explosion. Kind of like imagine like there was having a bomb or explode all the components apart. There's a cylindrical explosion. And then you have your individual ones where you can select certain, like for maybe I just want to do the motor, the propeller, and the spinner, I can translate that individually, right? This will probably be very useful when you're doing your either animations or doing exploited views step by step and showing how all the parts come together, right? So the question is, once this is, say this is exploded out, how do you get it back to where it was? So you kind of notice I did a Control Z or a undo, right? But then sometimes that's not going to be available, especially if you're kind of doing the rest of them. Like for example, these guys, and I'm translating this out, these ones too, and then say we'll choose this one too. Now if I were to undo and undo, that doesn't make too much sense, right? Because then you're gonna have to depend on that. You want to know where its neutral position is. So the neutral position is taken from the SOLIDWORKS file, right? The metadata and the location information is brought in, the location of the components are from the SOLIDWORKS file. What you're looking for is this restore neutral position. And really what the restore neutral position does specifically, it looks at the location of where the components are, and when you click on it, then whatever we have selected, for example, if I click on these three here, and then if I click on restore neutral, the current selection will jump back to the location that was specified kind of in SOLIDWORKS, right, as its current neutral position. So that means that exploited views can be easily turned to kind of step-by-step instructions by telling parts to go back to where they belong, right? Kind of in layman's terms. One thing to keep in mind too is other situations would be if you're bringing in a component that's maybe not part of the assembly, and then it's inserted. It has a neutral position. So what you can do is you can specify using there's a set as neutral properties. For example, being able to specify this location as its neutral property. So if I were to click neutral property, it would still maintain that same location. Okay. So there would be other situations kind of where it would call for that. But in this case, say we translated these out in terms of its locations, and then now we wanted to kind of return them back to where they are, right? This would another be a useful case for our selection set. So I'll select my propellers and just tell them to go back to neutral. All right. And, say we'll go ahead and rotate this and move these ones around a little bit. And then once we get to this point, we'll go ahead and create our view. So we have assembly, our collaboration tab, then we have our views. So at this point, you have the ability to create a new view. In this case, we have no views yet. So just simply left clicking on it. And what the view does is it takes a snapshot of exactly what you see here in our viewport, depending on kind of what we set to be our paper space. And then it'll incorporate all of that. So you're taking appearance properties, you're seeing the color, some of the opacity changes, things like that. And then there's also camera views, which will record your camera orientation. It doesn't change any of the properties. For example, the propellers won't change back to red based off of how they are. It just shifts the camera position to be the same as whatever is set in that one. You have update view. So say, for example, I were to just move this slightly, just change the camera position to give us more of a kind of an isometric view orientation. And say I want to capture that, I'll select the view and go here to update view, right? And then it'll update, you can see it updates in the thumbnail. Then we have update view with selected actors. Notice it's grayed out. Reason being is I have no actors selected. So if I clicked on this, say this top hood, if I click on it and I made a change and there were other views that I have inside of my composer, what I can do is I can select that and then also select the other views that I want to affect and then click on this button. And what it will do is update those views with that respective actor. So say that changed, the opacity changed back to what it was before. What I would do is select that, click on the other views, and then update that view with selected actor, and then all the rest of them will have that opacity change will carry through. Then we have our redraw all views. That's if like you import another model, changed it, you want it to kind of express and just refresh. It's like a rebuild, and it'll redraw all the views that we have. So in this case, we just have one. Right? And if there's any more views that we had, we can play through them. We can go to the previous view. We can play through the view. We can stop them and then go to the next view. All right. So last thing is I'm going to change this view 1 here. And then say let's call this one my default view. In the next video series, what we're going to do is we're going to cover a concept called the default view or the baseline property view, right? And just to show you real quick, I'm just going to show you, and then the concept will make more sense later on when we do the next video. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another view. And in this view here, I'm going to do what we call a, there's a restore neutral properties. As you remember your neutral properties, there's also location, but there's also the opacity, the color, basically whatever the properties were when we brought this one in. So when I click on restore neutral, right, for all my components, just click restore neutral, right, with what I selected. Notice what went back was the propellers, and then the opacity, and then anything else I would have changed too. If I were to translate these ones around, move back to its neutral position, right? So you can kind of compare the two. If I update this view between my default view here and this view 2. And where this comes into play is when you update something. For example, say there's a change been made in the SOLIDWORKS model, and we want to make sure that change carries through, we will update our composer model. But the thing is, when that does that, because the SOLIDWORKS model is driving our composer model, the SMG file, the neutral properties will get removed, right? It'll be overridden by the ones inside of our SOLIDWORKS file. So that means that any kind of neutral properties that we set will be replaced with the new ones. So the default view we had, remember where we spent time changing the opacity and the color, and then anything else that we would have changed with like the render style, that's going to keep here because we have this default view. This is also something called the baseline property view. That's something that just a term and a phrase that we coined. But we'll go more in depth on that. There'll be a specific video kind of next to talk about that. So this is a very, very important concept. Okay. So after we have our view, we talked a bit about the view buttons. I just wanted to kind of review what we covered today. So first one was selection sets, just understanding the importance of selection sets. And once again, these can be done out of order. If I were to do part properties first and then environmental effects and selection sets and vice versa, it's really up to you, right? They're all independent in each way. They don't have to be done specifically and set in that order, right? So selection sets, if you guys just remember why we would create them, just the grouping of our components, nuts and bolts, the ability to just hide and hide them as needed, isolate certain collection of components, especially if they're not grouped in a subassembly already, kind of in our SOLIDWORKS model, and then just selecting that's much easier. Then there are environmental effects where we change the page size and then went through the publication aspect and then modified the ground and then included the lighting. And then afterwards, the part properties where we can change it individually, one component, and then we decided we like the appearance of any of our other ones. We can copy the appearance over and so it can populate. Modifying any of its opacity properties where, say, of our transparency, we want to be able to see inside some of our components. The opacity slider will allow us to move that and make it a little bit more, our components more transparent. Hiding components and changing the render style. And then last thing is locations, understanding neutral position, where along with the neutral properties, the neutral position also controls kind of where it is. So if I were to do that neutral properties before, it also tracks neutral position. So it's not only doing the colors and any properties that have changed, right, as well as opacity, but it's also its position. And then after, once we get that and prepped up in the right way, we can take a screenshot, we can take a view of that, right? Any changes we make there afterwards and we want to update that view, you can. And in that case, those are with all our properties that have changed. We're going to call that our default view or also our baseline property view. So later on, if we make any kind of edits or updates into our SOLIDWORKS model, and then we push those through, we can then apply those properties back into our composer file. Okay, so most of the things, if you've been using SOLIDWORKS Composer for a while, maybe you kind of known them, and maybe it's just a good reminder, but just we wanted to kind of make sure that everyone's on the same page in terms of the core concepts, and then just making sure, prepping the model, what things are important, what things you want to look out for. Maybe you've been doing some of them, but then maybe selection sets you really haven't gotten used to before.